The first thing they took was his badge. The second thing they took was his name. They didn't know that the third thing, the only thing that actually mattered, wasn't something you could take with a tribunal, order, or a corporate mandate, or even a plasma discharge aimed center mass at a man standing alone in a corridor that smelled like recycled air and someone else's fear. The third thing was the part of James Beaumont Fitzgerald that had grown up watching his father get up at 4 in the morning every single day of his working life to do a job that no one thanked him for, in a city that chewed people up and handed back the bones with a receipt. The third was the part that had watched his father do that and thought, yeah, me too, that's the job. They couldn't take that. They should have tried harder. The directorate came through on a Tuesday, which was the kind of mundane detail that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow always did when you were trying to reconstruct the exact moment your life split into before and after. Tuesdays, the middle of the week when no one was watching, when the administrative machinery of civilization ran its quietest errands. They came in 3 shuttles, governance class, the flat gray ones that didn't have windows, because the occupants had decided a long time ago that they didn't need to see what they were flying over, and they landed on the roof of the Enforcement Bureau's District 7 complex at 0600 hours, which was when the night shift was filing their last reports, and the day shift hadn't yet finished their coffee. Fitzgerald was in the middle of his second cup when Supervisor Henley Okafor came into the break room, with the expression of a man who had just been handed a live grenade and told to hold it until the meeting was over. "They're here," Henley Okafor said. "I know," Fitzgerald said. "I can hear the ventilation change. 3 ships. JB, I know, Marcus." He finished the coffee. It was bad coffee. The kind that had been cycled through a machine so many times, it tasted more like the memory of coffee than the actual substance. He had drunk it every morning for 11 years. He put the cup down on the counter next to the small framed photograph of his daughter that he'd brought in on his first day and never taken home because the bureau had felt more like home than his apartment had since Elena left. "How long have I got? Enough to make it look dignified." He nodded and stood up. He was a big man, 6 feet and change, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual physical work rather than vanity, with a jaw that looked like someone had built it from structural materials, and a face that had accumulated its years honestly, the kind of face where every line had a story and most of the stories involved someone trying to do something wrong while Fitzgerald was in the vicinity. He was 43 years old. He had spent 22 of those years in service, 4 with the planetary militia, 18 with the Bureau, the last 6 as the head of District 7's Special Investigations Unit. He had closed 231 cases. He had never once been formally reprimanded. He followed Henley Okafor up 3 flights of stairs and into the main conference room, where 4 men and a woman he had never seen before were already seated at the long table, with the kind of comfortable, practiced authority of people who did this regularly and experienced no cognitive dissonance about it whatsoever. The woman was clearly in charge. She had the directorate's insignia on her collar, a stylized eye above 2 parallel bars, which had always struck Fitzgerald as unfortunately honest about what the organization actually was, and the specific expression of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to end, and was merely going through the procedural motions of letting it appear to have been a discussion. Her name, he would learn later, was Director Cassian Vore. She had been with the directorate for 20 years. She had overseen the systematic dismantling of 7 independent enforcement units across 4 sectors. She had, according to his own files, which he had spent the previous 3 nights compiling and encrypting onto a data chip the size of a thumbnail, direct financial ties to 4 of the 9 largest corporate entities operating in the outer colonies. She had authorized, through 17 layers of administrative language, designed to make authorization look like oversight, the use of enforcement assets, which meant his people with names and mortgages and children, as operational instruments in corporate security disputes that had nothing to do with law, order, justice, or any other word that had ever meant anything to anyone who'd actually had to live under those concepts. She looked at him the way you look at an outdated appliance you've brought someone in to dispose of. "Inspector Fitzgerald," she said. "Not sergeant, not captain, not any of the titles his rank actually carried. Inspector the way you might say mechanic or clerk. We appreciate your cooperation." "I haven't cooperated yet," he said pleasantly. "You haven't asked me to do anything." One of the men at the table, younger, soft around the jaw, the kind of face that had never worried about anything because the right kind of money had always been nearby, shifted in his chair. Vore didn't blink. The findings of the internal governance review, she said, are conclusive. Your unit's unauthorized investigation into Meridian Corporation's labor contracts. The labor contracts that specified 18-hour shifts for indentured colonists working atmospheric processors in vacuum conditions with inadequate equipment. Yes, I know which investigation. Conducted without Bureau authorization, using Bureau resources, and resulting in the exposure of classified partnership agreements between the Directorate and its corporate development partners. I'd call them bribes, Fitzgerald said. But I'm a simple man. Vor's expression didn't change. You are suspended effective immediately. Your unit will be dissolved. Your access to Bureau systems will be terminated. You will surrender your credentials, your service weapon, and all investigative materials compiled during your unauthorized inquiry. She paused. The materials, Inspector, all of them, will know if you've retained copies. He unclipped his badge from his chest and set it on the table. He placed his weapon beside it. He looked at both objects for a moment, the badge he'd earned, the weapon he'd been trusted with, the tools of 22 years of trying to do something useful with his existence, and then he looked up at Cassian Vor. You're going to want to know something, he said. I'm sure I won't. The colonists at the Meridian processor stations, 146 of them died last cycle in a decompression event that your corporate partners classified as an equipment malfunction. It wasn't. I have the engineering reports. The life support systems were deliberately underfunded for 3 consecutive budget cycles specifically to improve Meridian's quarterly projections. 146 people. They had names. They had families. Some of them had kids about the age of... He glanced at the photograph of his daughter that he'd taken out of his pocket that morning and was holding in his left hand now, the one none of them had noticed because nobody in this room was actually trained to observe things. About the age of mine. Silence. You're going to want to know that, he said, because about 5 years, when this comes apart, the way these things always come apart, I want you to remember that I said it to your face in this room on a Tuesday morning. He walked out. Nobody stopped him because he'd already given them what they came for. And because men like the one sitting at that table had a deeply ingrained institutional belief that taking the badge was the same as taking the man. They were wrong about that. They would spend the next 4 years discovering exactly how wrong. What happened next is not the part of this story that begins with humans facing something they had never encountered before. That part begins later, on a Thursday, because the universe, like the Directorate, also conducts its most disruptive business in the middle of the week, when nobody is ready. What happened in the 4 years between the Tuesday and the Thursday was this. Fitzgerald disappeared into the kind of life that a man builds when the official version of his life has been canceled. He found a room in the transit district of Sector 9, a neighborhood that the city's development algorithms had apparently decided was not worth optimizing, which meant it still had things like actual human landlords and cash-operated businesses and residents who looked at strangers with the kind of flat, assessing wariness that comes from having been burned before. He found work, courier work first, then private investigation for individuals and small businesses who couldn't afford the Bureau's service fees and didn't trust them anyway. He compiled his files. He found 3 other people who had run into the same wall he had, a former Bureau data analyst named Torrance Adeyemi, who had lost her position after flagging anomalous resource diversions from the colonial development budget. A journalist named Piotr Laskowski, who had published the first piece, had his press credentials stripped, and was now writing under 14 different pseudonyms for underground data feeds. And a woman named Dr. Asha Nkosi, a colonial medical officer who had filed official reports on the Meridian decompression deaths and received, in response, a transfer order to a weather monitoring station at the polar ice cap that everyone understood to mean, go away and stop talking. The 4 of them met monthly in the back room of a food stall that Adeyemi's cousin operated, eating food that was better than it had any right to be given the location and the equipment, and they built, piece by piece, the thing that Vor had been afraid of when she'd sent Fitzgerald out of that conference room without placing him under arrest. But the arrest would have been cleaner but noisier. Vor was too good at her job to make that kind of noise. What she didn't understand, what people who operate through systems never quite understand about people who operate through stubbornness, is that quiet exile is not the same as defeated exile. The difference is audible if you know how to listen. A defeated man goes home and drinks. A quietly exiled man goes home and catalogs. Fitzgerald cataloged. He cross-referenced. He built the kind of evidentiary structure that had made him one of the Bureau's best investigators when the Bureau had been something he believed in, and he did it off the books. In the gaps between courier routes and private cases, in the small hours of the morning when the transit district went quiet enough that you could hear the ventilation systems in the walls, and he thought about his daughter, who was 12 now and lived with her mother, and didn't fully understand why her father had stopped being a policeman. And he thought about 146 people who had died in vacuum and been filed as line items. And he kept building. He was in the middle of building on a Thursday morning in the 4th year when the sky changed. Nobody agreed afterward on how to describe what happened to the sky. The official record, compiled by the Directorate's Communication and Information Bureau 6 hours after the event, described it as an anomalous electromagnetic signature consistent with high-mass transit emergence events in low atmospheric orbit. The data feeds, the ones that still existed, the underground ones that Laskowski contributed to, described it as 15 ships the size of city, blocks dropping out of nowhere above 3 separate population centers simultaneously. The woman who ran the food stall downstairs from Fitzgerald's room, who had gone outside to adjust the awning when her internal sensors started, giving her errors she didn't recognize, described it as the sky folding. Fitzgerald was on the roof. He went there sometimes in the early morning, when the transit district was at its quietest, to drink coffee that was only marginally better than bureau coffee and look at the city and remind himself why he was still doing what he was doing, instead of accepting the generous severance package that the Directorate had eventually offered him as a softer form of the message they hadn't been able to deliver the first time. The roof had a good view to the northeast, where on clear days you could see the edge of the Meridian corporate cluster, the gleaming towers where the decisions got made that killed 146 people. And sometimes he looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood that isn't properly joined yet and thinks, I'll get to that. He was looking northeast when the sky folded. It folded like something that had always been a lid being lifted. Not violently. There was no explosion. No light show that the entertainment industry had spent decades leading humanity to expect as the aesthetic accompaniment to extraterrestrial arrival. It was more subtle than that, more careful. The air pressure changed first, in a way that his body registered before his mind did, a compression event that pressed briefly against his eardrums and then released. Then the light shifted, not dimmed, exactly, but redistributed, as though something very large had repositioned itself above the city, and the morning sun was now bouncing off angles that hadn't existed 10 seconds ago, and then the sound came, a low, resonant harmonic that wasn't quite in the audible range, but was close enough to it that the body interpreted it as sound, as an enormous chord played on an instrument built to the scale of architecture rather than music. And then the ship was simply there, in the way that problems you've been ignoring eventually become there. 1.5 kilometers long, he estimated, and the estimate turned out later to be accurate, curved in a way that suggested biological rather than mechanical design, the surface a deep, non-reflective color that sat somewhere between green and black in a way that his brain kept trying to categorize and failing. It didn't hover. It sat in the air, which should not have been possible for something that size and standard gravity, which meant whatever was keeping it up was not using any method his engineering training recognized. It had no visible propulsion, no weapons visible, though something about its lines suggested weapons, the way certain human silences suggest thoughts you probably don't want to hear out loud. He looked at it for 42 seconds. Then he went downstairs, woke Adeyemi with a call, and said, "Get Laskowski and Nkosi. This changes the timeline." "The ships?" Adeyemi said. She'd already been awake. "There are 15 of them. I'm seeing feeds from Sector 3 in the Northern Corridor." "JB, what are these things?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know what the Directorate is going to do about them." "What?" "The wrong thing," he said. "Get the others. We have about 6 hours before this gets complicated." It took 4. The Directorate's initial response to the arrival of what would eventually be designated the Veth, a name derived from the first deciphered phoneme of their communication signals, which sounded to human ears like nothing so much as the letter V followed by a resonance too low for words, was, as Fitzgerald had predicted, the wrong thing. They mobilized enforcement assets. They deployed the Bureau's Tier 1 units, the ones with the good equipment, the ones that Vor had been redirecting toward corporate security operations for 6 years, but still technically existed as emergency response infrastructure. They set up a perimeter around the largest ship, which had positioned itself directly above the governance quarter, which Fitzgerald noted as either an intentional provocation or an exceptionally poor choice of landing site, and then they did the thing that government bodies with secrets always do. when confronted with something that could expose those secrets. They locked down information, emergency communications protocols, civilian data feeds suspended, independent media operations, the licensed ones, which meant the ones the Directorate controlled, placed under direct government oversight, pending the resolution of the emerging security event. Borders between sectors sealed, civilian movement restricted. None of this would have been especially surprising under any large-scale emergency. What made it the wrong response to this particular emergency was something that Fitzgerald had understood for the past 4 years and was now watching play out in real time. The Directorate didn't control the situation. They controlled the information about the situation, which is what they'd always been good at, but the actual situation, 15 ships of unknown origin holding position above 3 population centers, with no communication received and no action taken despite the perimeter, was beyond their operational experience. They were doing what they knew how to do. They just didn't know how to do what was actually needed. What was actually needed, in Fitzgerald's assessment, was someone who had spent 22 years being trained to de-escalate rather than dominate, someone who understood that the first conversation you have with an unknown party is the one that sets every tone for every conversation that follows, and that setting that tone with guns pointed is a fundamentally different opening than setting it with a door held open. He communicated this view to Adeyemi, who communicated it to the 3 other people in the now cramped back room of the food stall, where they had gathered with their devices and their files and their coffee in the gray light of a morning that had changed the world in ways that were not yet fully visible. "You want to walk up to an alien spacecraft," Laskowski said flatly. "No," Fitzgerald said. "I want to walk toward it." "There's a difference." "Walk me through that difference," Dr. Nkosi said. She was the calmest person in the room, which Fitzgerald had always appreciated. Medical training, he thought. You learn not to panic in front of the patient. Walking up to it implies I'm trying to make contact on my terms. Walking toward it implies I'm making myself visible and available and letting them decide whether contact happens. I'm not going to knock on the door. I'm going to stand in their line of sight and exist without threatening anything. He paused. The perimeter the Bureau set up is armed and aggressive. From the outside, if you're an unknown entity looking at this planet for the first time, that's what humanity looks like. I want to offer a different version. With what authority? Laskowski asked. You're a fired cop. No authority, Fitzgerald said. That's the point. Authority is institutional. Institutions are what they've already seen. I'm a private citizen with no weapons, no uniform, and no enforcement capacity, which means I'm the most honest picture of what we actually are that anyone's going to be able to offer them. The silence lasted about 10 seconds. You're going to get killed, Adeyemi said. Probably not, he said. If they wanted to kill us, they would have started already. They've been sitting there for 4 hours and they haven't done anything. That tells me something. What does it tell you? He thought about it. He'd spent his career reading situations, reading the spaces between what people said and what they meant, between what was in the file and what the file was trying not to say. He'd learned to listen to what wasn't being said, to attend to the negative space of a scene. 15 ships, sitting still, no communication, no action, no hostile gesture, no departure. They're waiting for something, he said. And I don't think it's for us to come at them with more guns. He walked through the perimeter at 1340 hours. Not past it, through it. There's a specific competence that comes from having spent 18 years in enforcement, knowing exactly how coverage zones overlap and where the gaps are. And Fitzgerald had mapped the Bureau's perimeter deployment patterns from institutional memory and the feed footage that Adeyemi had been aggregating since the lockdown. He went through the gap between 2 Tier 1 units in a maintenance corridor beneath the governance quarter's eastern infrastructure ring, emerged in the open space below the ship's ventral surface, and stood there in a plaza that would normally have been full of administrative workers and vendors. And the particular noise of civic life, now empty and silent under a sky that was partly natural atmosphere and partly something else. The ship was close enough that he could feel the harmonic it produced as a physical sensation in his chest. Not unpleasant. Not pleasant either. It was neutral in the way that large natural phenomena are neutral. A cliff face, a deep river, a sky before weather. He stood in the middle of the plaza with his hands at his sides, visible, still. He waited. He had waited in a lot of places for a lot of things. Stakeouts that ran 17 hours. Evidence that took 3 years to materialize. His daughter's first call after Elena left, which took 4 days and felt longer than both of those. He had a capability for stillness that most people in enforcement lost after their first year when the job trained you into a constant alert readiness that eventually became indistinguishable from agitation. He had kept the stillness because he'd understood early that the thing you were looking for always moved before you did if you stayed still long enough. After 6 minutes, something moved on the ship's ventral surface, a section of the non-reflective green-black material. He'd been examining it at close range now, and it was clearly not metal in any conventional sense. The surface had a texture that changed slightly depending on the angle of light, and parts of it seemed to have a slow, barely perceptible movement beneath them, like circulation, opened in a way that was more like relaxing than like a hatch operating. There was no mechanical sound. The opening was roughly 2 meters wide and 3 meters tall, and from it descended a structure that he could only describe as a ramp made of the same material extruding downward at a shallow angle until it touched the plaza surface, approximately 30 meters from where he stood. He didn't move. 3 figures emerged. The Veth, he would later articulate to the combined xenobiology and diplomatic teams that would spend the next 18 months trying to catch up with what he had already learned, were not built on a framework that evolution had reached through the same logic it had used to build humans. They were upright, that much was familiar, but the uprightness was achieved differently, through a skeletal geometry that suggested multiple potential upright orientations rather than one primary one, as though standing on 2 limbs was a preference rather than a structural necessity. They were tall. The shortest of the 3 was close to 3 meters, and the coloring of their exterior was the same deep green-black as the ship's surface, which he didn't think was coincidence. The face, if it was a face, was a region of concentrated sensory organs rather than a set of features, and it was located at the top of the body, in a position that suggested forward-facing vision, but in a configuration that turned out, later, to encompass a much wider field than human visual range. They descended the ramp slowly. They stopped at the bottom of it, 30 meters away, and looked at him, or attended to him. He wasn't certain which verb was accurate. He looked back at them. He was afraid. There's no useful story to be told that leaves out the fear. And any account that tried to describe what he did next as the action of a man without fear would be doing a disservice to the actual nature of the thing, which was that he was afraid in the specific, useful way that a person is afraid when they understand exactly what the stakes are and have decided to act anyway. His hands were steady. His breathing was steady. Under those steadinesses, his heart was doing something complicated that he would describe later to Nkosi, who was a doctor and therefore interested in these things, as feeling like trying to process too many inputs at once. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, every movement deliberate and visible, the way you move when you are in a situation where being misread will end you, and took out the small framed photograph of his daughter. He held it up. Later, when the translation frameworks were sophisticated enough to support retrospective analysis of the early interactions, he asked the Veth representatives what they had made of this gesture. The answer was rendered in the imperfect approximation of Veth conceptual, language that the translation systems could manage, and it came out as something like, a small preserved image of a smaller member of your species, held outward in a context of non-aggression, communicated, I have something that I protect. I am not only myself, I am also in relation. The gesture meant, I am not just a threat assessment, I am a person. He hadn't planned it. He'd taken the photograph out of his apartment that morning. When he'd left to come here, knowing what he was going to do, giving the risk the full weight of consideration, and deciding anyway, because it was the thing he always took with him when he was going somewhere, the outcome was uncertain. He'd had it in his pocket on hard raids, on the Meridian investigation, on the morning of his tribunal. He took it not as a talisman, but as a reminder, as a specific and material answer to the abstract question of why. The why that you needed to be able to answer when the official reasons were gone, and the institutional backing was gone, and you were standing in a cleared plaza under an alien ship with nothing but the conviction that the thing you were doing was worth doing, and the photograph of a 12-year-old girl who deserved to grow up in a world where humans, and whatever this was, had found a way to talk to each other. The Veth looked at the photograph for a long time. Then one of them, the one in the center, which he eventually understood to be a structural placement, indicating a specific role in communication rather than seniority, reached into the folds of what might have been clothing, or might have been an extension of its own body, and removed an object of its own. The object was small, small enough to be held in what served it as a hand, and appeared to be some kind of container, rounded, made of a material he couldn't identify at distance. It held the object outward in a posture that was nothing like a human's posture but carried, unmistakably, the same intention. Here, I also have something. He took a step forward. The Veth in the center took a step forward. They met with enormous slowness and care in the middle of the plaza. What followed was not a conversation. It was the attempt at the infrastructure of a conversation, which is different, slower, more fragile, more subject to catastrophic misinterpretation at every step. Fitzgerald had no xenolinguistics training. He had investigation training, which emphasized observation, pattern recognition, and the discipline of sitting with incomplete information, rather than rushing to fill in the gaps with assumptions. The second skill turned out to be more useful than the first. He spent 4 hours in the plaza with the three Veth, watched at a distance by bureau units who were receiving increasingly frantic instructions from Vor's command center, and apparently choosing to interpret maintain perimeter as remain at perimeter rather than advance on the unarmed civilian who has somehow done what none of your armed units accomplished. He would learn later that the order to remove him by force had been issued twice and ignored both times by the perimeter. Commander on the ground, a bureau captain named Yelena Marsh, who had served under Fitzgerald before his termination, and who apparently decided, without communication with her superiors, that watching how this was playing out was more valuable than interrupting it. He learned, in those 4 hours, approximately 11 things. First, the Veth communicated in a system that combined tonal resonance, geometric gesture, and what appeared to be direct conceptual transmission through low-frequency harmonic emission, something that the biology teams would later identify as a form of somatic empathic signaling, meaning the Veth could communicate emotional and conceptual states directly as physiological experience in nearby beings. Not telepathy, not quite, more like the way music moves through a body rather than only through the ears. Second, the Veth had been observing the planet for considerably longer than 4 hours. Based on the gestural communication he was attempting to interpret and what felt like, what registered in his body as a sense of long watching, of extended patience, he estimated months, possibly years. Third, they were not here because they'd stumbled across humanity by accident. Fourth, they were not here to establish trade or conquest or any of the other frameworks that human historical imagination had built for the concept of first contact. They were here because of something they had seen he didn't know. On that first day, what the something was. He learned it in pieces over weeks of increasingly sophisticated attempts at communication with progressively more sophisticated tools as the xenolinguistics teams arrived and the translation frameworks began to take shape. But on that first day in the plaza, what he understood, what settled in his body through the Veth's harmonic signaling in a way that bypassed language entirely and went directly to something closer to experience, was a sense of magnitude, not threat, not benevolence, magnitude, the sensation of something very large paying very close attention. Fifth, the Veth were capable of violence. This was not a guess. This was in their posture, their physical architecture, the design of their ship, and what he was slowly beginning to read as their history, as communicated through harmonic emotional transmission. They were not peaceful beings. They were beings who had made choices about when to use what they were capable of, which is a different thing entirely. Sixth, the perimeter around them did not frighten them. Seventh, it did something else. He was working on what that something else was when the Directorate's intervention came. The vehicle came from the north, one of the armored government transports, not bureau issue but Directorate, the black and silver ones that always looked like they were designed by someone who wanted you to feel their approach before you could see it. It stopped at the edge of the plaza, and Cassian Vor got out. She had 2 armed escorts, and she walked across the plaza with the specific purposefulness of someone who had decided that the scene being played out here was unacceptable and was going to be corrected. The 3 Veth watched her approach. Something changed in the harmonic. Fitzgerald felt it before he understood it, a shift in the frequency of the low-level resonance that had been running beneath the entire 4-hour interaction, a change in the emotional weather of the plaza that registered in his chest as something tightening. He looked at the Veth. The central figure's sensory region was oriented toward Vor. The 2 flanking figures had shifted their geometric posture in a way he'd been learning to read. And what he was reading was not aggression exactly, but something like the state that precedes aggression, a reassessment, a recalibration of threat level. Get back, he said to Vor without turning around. Inspector Fitzgerald, she said, and the title was still wrong in the same way it had been 4 years ago, stripped of everything it was supposed to carry. You are interfering in a Directorate-managed security operation, and you will step away from. Director. He turned around then. She was 12 meters away. Her escorts had their hands near their weapons. I need you to stop walking. and I need those escorts to put their hands somewhere else. Right now, you have no authority. I know, he said. I know I have no authority. I know exactly what I am here, and what I am is a private citizen who has just spent 4 hours building the beginning of something that will determine what happens next between our species, and what you are about to do with those weapons, and that posture is damage it. Stop. Walking. She stopped walking. Not because he'd told her to, he knew her well enough by now to know she didn't operate that way, but because the Veth had done something that she presumably had enough survival instinct to notice. The two flanking figures had taken what could only be described as a combat stance, not aggressive, not committed, but ready in the way that the body is ready when it's deciding something. The harmonic had dropped into a register that he was beginning to associate from purely physical response with the word danger, the kind of register that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up and made the back of his brain suggest that finding cover might be advisable. Vor stopped walking. The harmonic held. Then Fitzgerald did something that he would not be fully able to explain afterward to the diplomatic teams, who wanted a logical rationale for every gesture and choice. He turned back to the central Veth, looked directly into the sensory region, and he did the exact thing he'd been doing all afternoon. He waited. He stayed still. He let the harmonic work. He let his body communicate what his body was capable of communicating without words, which was, I see what is happening. I understand what is happening. I am not moving. I am here. The central Veth attended to him. He thought about his daughter. He was aware that this was an odd thing to do in the middle of a first contact event, but he'd learned a long time ago that the best thing to focus on when you were afraid and needed to stay present was something specific and true, rather than something abstract and strategic. So he thought about her, his daughter Celia, who was 16 now, and brilliant and impossible, and who had called him the week before out of the blue and asked him, in the way teenagers ask things that matter, when they've decided they can trust you with it, whether he thought that what they were hearing about the corporate deaths in the colonies was real, and what he was doing about it. He told her the truth, yes, and everything I can. She'd been quiet for a moment, and then said in the specific tone she'd had since she was small, the tone that meant she'd made a decision rather than expressed a preference. Then I'll help. He held all of that in him while the harmonic settled. It took 40 seconds. The resonance eased back into its lower, neutral register. The flanking Veth returned to their previous posture. The central figure did something, a gesture he didn't yet have a name for directed at Fitzgerald that felt, in the harmonic, like understood, like noted. He exhaled slowly and turned around to face Vor. They don't like the guns, he said quietly. They understand what guns mean. They've been watching us for longer than we know. And I'm not certain, but I think that they came here in spite of the guns because they saw something else too. Something about us that was worth the risk of the guns. If you deploy force here, you're going to end that, and I am telling you this not as an officer or an operative or anything with authority. I'm telling you as a person who has been standing in this plaza, watching something extraordinary happen, and I am asking you, Director Vor, as one human being to another, to walk back to your vehicle and let me keep doing this. Vor looked at him. For a moment, one specific moment that he would think about later, often, he saw something move behind her eyes that wasn't calculation or institutional reflex. Something that might have been uncertainty. The particular uncertainty of a person who has been very good at a system for a very long time suddenly presented with a situation that the system was not designed to handle. This is a directorate matter, she said. Quieter now. Yes, he said. It is. And I'm the person who's been in the plaza for 4 hours while the directorate was setting up a perimeter. So let me keep doing the directorate's matter for a little while longer. She held the look for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back to her vehicle. Her escorts followed. Fitzgerald turned back to the Veth. The central figure was still attending to him. In the harmonic, in the register that his body was slowly learning to read with something, approximating vocabulary, there was something he translated as, the difficulty is known, and something else, lower, longer, something that his body translated with the uncertain and probably insufficient word, trust. The formal diplomatic process began 6 weeks later. Fitzgerald was not the head of it. He was given no official title, no credential, no institutional authority to conduct the negotiations that would define humanity's relationship with a species that had been watching humanity for 22 years from a distance of 4 light years, and had decided, based on what they had observed, that the visit was worth attempting. He was a private citizen, technically unemployed, who showed up to every session in the same jacket he'd been wearing in the plaza, with the photograph of his daughter in his left pocket. and sat at the table not as a diplomat, but as the person who had been there first, and who the Veth had indicated through a harmonic communication that took the linguists 3 days to fully parse. They preferred to include in the conversations. The linguists were extraordinary. He gave them full credit. The translation frameworks they built in those 6 weeks were more sophisticated than anything that had previously existed in xenolinguistics. Because there had been no xenolinguistics before, and watching 3 experts in cognitive science, acoustic physics, and comparative anatomy build a field from scratch in real time had been one of the most impressive things he'd witnessed in a life that had included more than its share of things worth witnessing. By the time the formal sessions began, they could conduct limited but meaningful exchange. Enough for intent, enough for context, enough for the critical early business of establishing what both parties were actually doing in this room. What the Veth were actually doing was, as he had intuited in the plaza, more complicated than any of the standard contact scenarios. They were not colonizers. Their civilization occupied 7-star systems. They were not looking for an 8th. They were not resource seekers. Their technology, the details of which would occupy human scientists for decades, was operating on principles that made human resource management look like Stone Age accounting, and they had no material need that the human system could meet. They were not explorers in the classical sense. Either they hadn't arrived as part of a survey mission, hadn't stumbled into humanity's corner of the galaxy through random transit. They had come specifically. They had come because of what they'd seen during the 22 years of observation. They had come because human civilization had, in that time, exhibited a pattern of behavior that the Veth's own historical experience had taught them to recognize as significant. What the pattern was required 17 sessions with the translation team to convey with enough precision to be useful, and when it finally came through, when the full concept arrived in a form that could be rendered in human language, it was not what anyone at the table had expected. The Veth had watched humanity fight itself. They had watched a species with the technology for interstellar colonization and the social structures of a civilization centuries behind its own technological capacity try, through 1,000 specific and particular individual efforts, to close that gap. They had watched lawyers and journalists and doctors and investigators and organizers, people with no special power, people who were frequently fired or imprisoned or simply disappeared by the systems they were challenging, try to hold the powerful accountable, try to keep the institutions honest, try to insist that the 146 names had to mean something, that they couldn't just be filed as equipment failures and budgeted into the next fiscal cycle. They had watched this happen repeatedly across 3 centuries of human social development, and they had recognized in it something that their own history had taught them was rare. Not goodness, exactly. The Veth had no naive concept of species-level goodness. They had seen enough civilizations, in their own history, in the traces of the 3 extinct species whose systems they had passed through, to understand that goodness was not a species trait, but an individual one. What they recognized was stubbornness, the specific, costly, exhausting, unjustifiable, logically indefensible stubbornness of a being that knows it's outmatched and keeps trying anyway. The stubbornness of Fitzgerald filing his last report on the night before his tribunal. The stubbornness of Adeyemi writing down the numbers one more time even when she already had the numbers written down. The stubbornness of Dr. Nkosi sending the medical reports into a system that had already decided not to receive them. The stubbornness of every person throughout human history who had looked at a wall and decided that the wall was wrong, and that being smaller, the wall was not a sufficient reason to stop pushing. The Veth, the translation team eventually conveyed, had come from a history that included 2 near-extinction events, one natural, one civilizational, the second type being the more common according to the accumulated record they carried of collapsed civilizations, and they had survived them both because of this quality, this specific, expensive, apparently irrational quality. And in their 22 years of observation, they had been watching to see whether humanity possessed it sufficiently, not in principle, not in its rhetoric, but in actual costly, individual practice. They had been watching J.B. Fitzgerald for 4 of those 22 years. He was not the only one they'd been watching. He was one of thousands. But he was the one who had been standing in the plaza, and so he was the one they stepped off the ramp for. And that was how the conversation started. He sat with this for a long time in the nights between sessions, in his room in Sector 9, with the noise of the transit district outside, and the photograph of Celia on the table, and the files that he'd been building for arrayed around him, half of them now redundant, because the conversation he'd been trying to force through the Bureau's own system had been rendered moot by an alien first contact event that was going to change every political calculation on the planet. He sat with the specific strange feeling of having been seen by something that had no obligation to see him and had chosen to anyway, and finding that it felt less like vindication than like continuation, like the work wasn't done, like there was just more of it now. He thought about his father, getting up at 4 in the morning. Yeah, me too. What happened with Vor took 3 more months. The Directorate had hoped, had in fact structurally assumed, that the arrival of the Veth would displace every other concern, that the magnitude of first contact would function as a civilizational reset, an event so large it would render the previous inventory of grievances and investigations and file room conspiracies insignificant by comparison. This was a logical assumption if you didn't know how humans worked. If you did know how humans worked, if you'd spent 22 years watching them, or if you'd spent 18 years as an investigator listening to what wasn't being said, you understood that the arrival of something unprecedented didn't erase the preceding thing, it illuminated it. It put it against a backdrop large enough that you could see all of it clearly for the first time. The files Fitzgerald had compiled, cross-referenced, and cross-confirmed by Adeyemi's data analysis, and Laskowski's sources, and Nkosi's medical documentation had been the foundation. The Veth's arrival was the context that made them impossible to contain, not because the aliens had anything to do with Meridian's labor contracts, but because the Directorate's response to first contact, the lockdown, the weaponized perimeter, the attempt to control information about an event that was simultaneously being observed by 15 ships full of beings who had been watching the information control systems work for 2 decades, had been exactly what the files documented, a system reflexively protecting itself rather than the people it was supposed to serve. You could argue, if you had good lawyers and institutional backing and control of the licensed press, that a corrupt investigation might be wrong or overstated or politically motivated. It was harder to argue that argument while you were sending armed escorts into an alien first contact scenario to retrieve an unauthorized civilian because he was inconveniently in the middle of successfully talking to the aliens. The case was filed jointly by Adeyemi, Laskowski, and Nkosi through 3 separate legal channels in 2 separate jurisdictions. It took 6 weeks to get past the initial suppression attempts. After that, with the data feeds running and the licensed press no longer fully compliant with Directorate messaging, because the Directorate no longer had the political capital to enforce compliance, it took 4 more weeks for the institutional archaeology to do what institutional archaeology eventually does when given sufficient exposure to air. Vor's formal resignation was announced on a Monday, which was the universe maintaining at least some variety in which days it chose for its most significant business. Fitzgerald heard about it from Adeyemi, who sent him a message in the middle of a translation session that said simply, "Done." He looked at the message for a moment. He was sitting across a table from a Veth linguist, a being whose name rendered in human phonetic approximation something like Vayan Sora, who had the kind of patient precision with language that he'd encountered before in the best evidence analyst he'd worked with. And he thought about 146 names that were now in every feed on the planet. Not a victory. He was clear about that in his own head. Not a victory, because the 146 were still gone, and a resignation was an acknowledgement rather than an undoing. And the system that had produced Vor was still substantially intact, and would take more than one case and one resignation to make significantly different, but a step. A costly necessary specific step of the kind that added up, over time, over the long argument that civilization was always making with itself, to something that mattered. Vansora had paused in the translation work. The Veth linguist was watching him, attending to him, and in the harmonic, in the register he had been learning to read for 3 months now, there was something he translated as a question. "It's fine," he said. "I just got some news." The harmonic said something else. He was getting better at this. He translated it as "good news." "Yeah," he said. "Step by step," the harmonic responded. He'd learned this one well enough to be fairly confident. The translation was something close to, "That is how all distance is covered." He nodded and went back to work. The first formal treaty between humanity and the Veth was signed 11 months after the Plaza. Fitzgerald attended as a witness, still no official title, still the same jacket, still the photograph in his left pocket. The ceremony was held in the open air rather than inside any building, which had been the Veth delegation's preference, and which had struck the human diplomatic staff as symbolically appropriate in ways that several of them wrote papers about afterward. The Governance Quarter Plaza, the specific plaza, the one below the ventral surface of the first ship, had been repurposed as a permanent meeting ground, the buildings around it reconfigured to create an open amphitheater, with no walls between it and the sky. The ship was still there. It would remain there for 2 more years, which was the Veth transit timeline for the initial exchange mission, and which Fitzgerald had already worked out was not a coincidence with any other particular timeline, but was simply how long the Veth reckoned it would take to do the next stage of what they'd come to do properly. The Veth did not rush things that shouldn't be rushed. This was something he respected about them, more than almost anything else he'd learned. Celia was there. She had come down from the university. She was studying xenosociology, which was a field that had been invented approximately 9 months ago by people who had realized that the field they were actually practicing needed a name, and she stood beside him during the signing, very still, with the particular expression of someone who is watching something they will remember for the rest of their life and knows it. She was 20 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and a way of looking at a room that her father recognized as something she'd come by honestly. "How are you doing?" she asked quietly, while the diplomatic teams arranged themselves for the formal documentation. "Good," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the accurate one." He glanced at her sideways. "How are you doing?" She thought about it. She had thought carefully before answering. "Like I'm watching something begin," she said. "Not like an ending." "Good," he said. "It isn't an ending. It's about the 7th step of something with a lot more steps. How many? I don't know. But it's not an ending." She nodded. He thought she understood. He thought she'd understood for a long time, from the early morning phone calls, and the visiting hours, and the way she'd grown up watching a man who had been stripped of every official credential and institutional backing continue to do what he did, because the thing he was doing was correct, and the correction didn't depend on whether anyone with authority agreed. He thought she'd learned something from that, the way children learn from what their parents do, rather than what they say. He thought maybe that was the other thing the Veth had seen in 22 years of watching. Not just the individual acts, but the transmission of them, the specific human mechanism of handing the stubbornness forward, generation to generation, in the small acts, and the daily insistence, and the 4 in the morning decisions that no one would ever put in a history book. The signing took an hour. When it was done, and the formal ceremony had dissolved into the specific social texture of a historic occasion, finding its own level, small conversations, the particular quality of silence that a large group of people settles into when they've done something irreversible. Together, he found a quiet place at the edge of the amphitheater and stood there with his coffee. He had brought his own this time. It was better than bureau coffee and considerably better than transit district coffee, which Celia had given him a hard time about. Sora found him there. The Veth linguist had become, over 11 months, the closest thing to a colleague that he'd found in the context of first contact. Not a friend, exactly, because the framework for friendship between species whose entire experiential worlds barely overlapped was something that was going to take more than 11 months to construct, but something like a colleague, someone whose competence he respected, who seemed to respect his, with whom the work of communication was also the work of something else, something he thought of as mutual orientation. We are both trying to find out where the other person stands. The harmonic was the social register today, the one that didn't carry urgency or question, the one that was closest to human small talk without being trivial, because the Veth didn't appear to have a concept of trivial social noise in quite the same way. Their communication was always doing something. He didn't try to translate immediately. He listened. He'd learned that the first pass at the harmonic was sometimes about the register itself, fact of communication rather than the content. The way the first few seconds of a human conversation are sometimes just the acknowledgement that a conversation is happening. Then Vayan Sora produced the object he had seen on the first day, the small rounded container, made of the unidentifiable material, held out in the same posture as the first day in the plaza, offered. He looked at it. He reached into his pocket and took out the photograph of Celia. He held it out. They stood like that for a moment, each holding out the thing they'd brought. The object the Veth offered. He understood now from months of contextual accumulation that it was a container for something recorded, a Veth equivalent of documentation, a vessel for preserved experience, their archival technology used to hold events that were important enough to carry. The Veth archivist, who had spent 11 months compiling the record of this contact, had given Vayan Sora this object to give to him, which meant the object contained a record, the first record, the Veth first record, of humanity as something other than a distant observation, as a presence, as a party to a conversation. He accepted it with both hands the way he'd learned was respectful. Vayan Sora accepted the photograph. Not permanently, he understood. This was an examination, an acknowledgement, a viewing, and attended to it for a long moment with the concentrated sensory attention that the Veth gave to things they found significant. The harmonic said something he'd heard before, in a different form, in a different context, but with the same essential structure, the same root meaning. He'd learned it over months as the Veth's way of acknowledging a difficult thing done well, a phrase without a clean human, analog, something between recognition and an expression of shared cost, between praise and solidarity, something that understood that the thing being acknowledged was hard and had been done anyway, and that this mattered. He nodded. Same to you, he said. The harmonic extended, shifted. The Veth had a particular modulation that functioned like a laugh. Not humor exactly, but something adjacent to it, the sound of a being acknowledging the delightful impossibility of a situation. And he smiled, because after 11 months, he had also learned that the Veth registered human facial expressions at enough detail to recognize that one. He pocketed his photograph. He held the archival object carefully. He drank his coffee. The sky above the amphitheater was ordinary, blue, slightly hazed at the horizon, the kind of sky that human beings had been looking up at for as long as they'd existed and interpreting according to whatever they needed to believe on a particular day. Today, above the blue and the haze, if you were looking in the right direction, you could see the ventral surface of the ship catching the morning light at an angle that made the non-reflective green-black material show the faint traces of something internal, the circulatory patterns the researchers had determined of a living system built on principles that would occupy biology for the next century at minimum. Celia appeared at his shoulder. What's that? She said, nodding at the archival object. A record, he said, of how this started. You going to be able to open it? Eventually, he said. Vain Sora is going to walk me through the access protocols. It'll take a few sessions. She looked at it. Then she looked at the ship. Then she looked at him with the expression she'd had since she was small. The one that meant she'd made a decision. I want to be there for those sessions, she said. I figured you would, he said. She nodded. He nodded. The morning went on around them. The history of it, the weight and the ordinariness of it, the specific texture of a world that had changed irreversibly and was now going about the business of figuring out what that meant, which was the work of generations rather than a ceremony. He had always been better with work than ceremony. He finished his coffee, step by step. That's how all distance is covered. That's the job. 6 years after the plaza, on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. The full translation of the Veth archival record was completed. He read it in the same room where he'd built the files, in Sector 9, with the transit district outside, and the morning quiet enough to hear the ventilation in the walls. Celia was there. She was the lead xenosociology consultant on the translation team, and had done more than anyone to structure the conceptual framework that made full translation possible. Adeyemi was there, and Laskowski and Nkosi, who had come back from the polar weather station 2 years ago and was now the head of the Joint Human-Veth Medical Exchange Program, which was doing things with trauma treatment and cellular biology that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. The record was long. It covered 22 years of observation in a form that wasn't quite narrative and wasn't quite data, something in between, something that conveyed both the factual inventory and the experiential weight of a long, careful watching from a very long way away. The last section of the record covered the plaza. He read it twice. What the Veth record said about the man who had walked into the plaza with his hands at his sides and a photograph in his pocket was not what he would have said about himself. It used the vocabulary of Veth historical documentation, which didn't distinguish between individual and event in the way human historiography did, and so his appearance in the plaza was written as a convergence, as the arriving point of 22 years of accumulated observation and 4 years of specific watching and the 1,000 prior humans who had done the same kind of thing in every century before this one, all of it arriving together in a plaza on a Thursday morning and standing still and waiting. He found this, on reflection, accurate. He found it, on further reflection, the thing about the whole business that he wanted Celia to understand most, and that she did understand. He thought already, because she had been watching him the way he had been watched, with the patient accumulation of someone who understood that the meaning wasn't in the event, it was in the accumulation. It was in all the Tuesdays and Thursdays and 4 in the mornings that built up, unannounced, into the specific shape of a person standing in a plaza, deciding that this was worth trying. He closed the record. He put the photograph of Celia on the table next to the archival object. He looked at both of them for a moment. Then he called Henley Okafor, Marcus, who had shown a ghost of something in the conference room on the morning of the tribunal, and who was now one of the key figures in the Reformed Bureau's oversight structure, the bureau that existed, because the old bureau structure had been quietly dismantled in the year after Vor's resignation. And he said, without preamble, which was how all their best conversations had always started, "I've got something I want you to read." "What is it?" "The Veth record. The full translation." A pause. "Is it what they said it would be?" "It's what they said. It's also more than what they said." He looked out the window at the transit district, which was the same as it had ever been, and also not, because everything was the same and not. "It's a record of us. From the outside. I think we should show it to people." "That's going to take some navigation," Henley Okafor said, which was his way of saying yes, and also it's complicated, and also I'm already thinking about how. "I know. That's why I'm calling you. You could run it yourself. I don't have the authority." JB. Henley Okafor's voice had the specific tone it had had in the conference room 6. Years ago, before the tribunal, the voice of a man choosing something. "You've been doing the most important work in human history for the last 6 years without authority. I don't think authority is the operational constraint here." Fitzgerald was quiet for a moment. "Get me a room," he said. "And coffee. Better than bureau coffee this time." "I'll see what I can do," Henley Okafor said. He hung up. He picked up the photograph and put it back in his left pocket, where it had always been, and where it would keep being, because some habits are structural rather than chosen, because some things are not about meaning or symbolism, but about the simple fact of carrying something true close to you while you do the work. He got up. He went to find out what came next. There was a moment he'd told no one about it until the year the record was translated, when he finally told Celia that it happened at around the 2-hour mark in the plaza, the moment when the harmonic changed in a specific way, and he'd felt something that his nervous system registered before his mind did, something that wasn't fear exactly, but was the physiological cousin of it, a full-body stillness, the kind that ancient bodies know is appropriate when something very old and very large is attending to you. It had lasted about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, he had thought, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the edge of things, "I could leave. Nothing here is stopping me from leaving. The perimeter is 40 meters in any direction. My feet work. I could turn around, walk back through the maintenance corridor, find Adeyemi and Laskowski and Nkosi in the food stall, have more coffee, and let the directorate manage this the way the directorate managed everything, which was badly and expensively, but ultimately without killing the man who used to be an inspector." He'd stood still, not because he was brave. He'd thought about that a lot over the years, and he had never arrived at the conclusion that bravery was the accurate word for what had happened. Bravery implied a dramatic act of will against fear, a choice to be something better than what you were. What he had done in those 4 seconds was less glamorous than that. He had stood still because standing still was consistent with what he had been doing for 4 years, which was consistent with what he had been doing for 22 years, which was consistent with what he had watched his father do for 40 years before that. He had stood still because leaving would have been a different person's choice, and he was this person. You did the job. The job was here. You stayed. The harmonic had settled. He had stayed. That was the whole of it. Celia had listened to this in the way she listened to things that mattered, still very present, with the same quality of attention he recognized as something she'd picked up from, and from the Veth both, having spent 3 years now working with beings for whom listening was the primary mode. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, that's the story." He thought about it. "That's part of the story." "No," she said, with the certainty she'd had since she was small and had always been right to have. "That's the story. That's what the Veth saw. That's what they came for. 4 seconds where a tired man who'd lost everything decided that standing still was more important than being safe. That's it. The whole thing is that." He looked at her. The afternoon light was coming in at an angle that made her look for a moment, impossibly young and impossibly old at the same time, the way people look when they've arrived at something true. He didn't argue. She was right. The entire immense machinery of First Contact, the translation teams and the treaty sessions and the xenosociology programs and the joint research, initiatives and the medical exchange and the archival records and the geometric slow turning of 2 civilizations learning to face each other across the enormous distance of their differences, all of it traced back, as far as he could tell, to 4 seconds in a plaza where a tired man decided that the job was here. He had spent his whole career learning to read the evidence. The evidence was consistent. He accepted it. He got up and made coffee. His daughter stayed to help. Outside, the city continued its argument with itself. The endless, costly, necessary argument of a species that had never quite agreed on what it owed itself, and kept insisting on the question anyway, kept sending the stubborn ones out to stand in the plazas and wait and hold out the photographs of the people they were doing it for. The Veth, from 4 light years away, had listened to that argument for 22 years and heard in it something worth the distance. The distance was still being covered, step by step. That's how it always went. That's how it always will. There is a particular quality to the work that never gets mentioned in the histories. The histories, and there were histories now, multiple, competing in a dozen languages and several more conceptual frameworks that weren't quite languages in the human sense, tended to organize events around moments. The plaza, the first treaty, the Veth record translation, the opening of the joint research station at the governance quarter compound, which had been renamed the contact quarter 2 years after the treaty, and which had subsequently become the physical address of more paradigm, shifting scientific exchange than anywhere else in human history. Moments, the kind of thing a narrative needs to be a narrative rather than a list. What the histories didn't cover, because histories were bad at it, was the texture of the days between moments. The days when the translation work hit a conceptual wall that had no door. When the Veth harmonic communication included a resonance pattern that didn't correspond to anything in the human experiential inventory, and the entire team sat for 3 days, trying to find an analog, and eventually concluded that there wasn't one, and they were going to have to build new cognitive infrastructure from scratch. Days when the political negotiations stalled because the Reform Directorate's successor bodies couldn't agree on jurisdiction for the joint research governance, and the argument was legitimate on both sides, and also was delaying things that mattered. Days when Fitzgerald sat in a session that had gone 3 hours past its scheduled end and could see that both sides of the table were exhausted, and making the kind of small errors that exhausted people make, and had to find the specific energy to say, with the patience that he'd been building in himself since he was a young officer on a night shift, with a situation that needed quieting, let's take 20 minutes, not to give up, not because anything has changed, just to let our heads catch up. The capacity for that, for the unglamorous middle distance between the moments, was something he'd been building for 43 years before the plaza and had continued building after it, and it was in his view the thing that actually ran the work. Not the moments, the days. He thought about this often in the second year, when the initial intensity of the contact had stabilized into something that still mattered enormously and was no longer novel, which was a strange shift to navigate. The whole planet had gone through it to varying degrees. The initial shock of first contact, then the period of intense global focus, then the gradual absorption of something world-changing into the texture of daily life, which was not the same as accepting it, but was the particular human mechanism for continuing to function while something enormous was still ongoing. People had breakfast. People had arguments about taxes. People fell in love and had children and became doctors and drove vehicles and did all the things that people did. And somewhere in the background, the greatest event in human history was continuing to unfold, staffed by humans who also had breakfast and arguments and all the rest of it. He found this not depressing, but clarifying. The enormity was real. The everydayness was also real. Both things were true. This was, he had concluded, the specific condition of being alive in any moment that mattered. You were always doing the historic and the mundane simultaneously, and the mundane was what made the historic sustainable. He had a routine in the second year. He arrived at the contact quarter at 0730. He had coffee, decent coffee now. The station had a machine that someone with better taste than him had selected. He read the overnight briefings from the Veth communication team. The Veth worked on a daily cycle that didn't precisely map to the human 24 hours, which meant there was always some overnight material. He spent the morning in translation work with whoever was on the session schedule. He had lunch with Celia on Wednesdays, when her research schedule and his aligned, at a food stall 2 blocks from the contact quarter that was owned by a different cousin of Adiemi's and also had implausibly good food. He spent the afternoon in whatever was needed. Meetings, writing, review, the occasional session that went long. He called Henley Okafor on Fridays. He called his daughter on Sundays. On Tuesdays, he walked to the plaza and stood there for 10 minutes with his coffee. He'd started doing this in the first month without entirely deciding to. Now it was a habit. He stood in the place where it had started and reminded himself of the full weight of what had happened there. not the historical weight, which was available at any hour from any number of sources, but the personal weight, the 4-second weight, the weight of a specific morning and a specific choice and a specific quality of stillness that had not felt, in the moment, like anything other than itself. The Veth who worked at the station had noticed this habit. He hadn't explained it. They hadn't asked, in the direct sense. But Vinsora, on a Tuesday 3 months into the second year, had joined him in the plaza and stood there with the same stillness for the same 10 minutes, and the harmonic during those 10 minutes had been the quiet register, the social one, the one that meant presence rather than communication, the Veth way of being with someone without that somewhere needing to be about anything other than what it was. He appreciated that more than he'd been able to say. He eventually said it anyway, imperfectly, through the translation system, on a morning when the session had gone well, and there was a brief opening for something that wasn't work. He said, "I appreciate that you come to the plaza on Tuesdays. It matters to me." Vayansora's response translated, "The place where something began is part of the record. The record should be witnessed." He had written that down. He had shown it to Celia. She had read it twice and then looked at him and said, "That's the thing, isn't it? The place where something began is part of the record. That's why you go. That's why it matters. Not because you're proud of it. Because you need to know it happened. That it was real." He thought she was right again. He thought she was going to be extraordinary at this work, at this century, at the enormous and patient task of being a person in the world the plaza had made possible. He thought she had built herself for it, the way his father had built himself for the 4 in the morning job, and the way Fitzgerald had built himself for the 22-year argument with a system that didn't want to hear what he had to say. You built yourself for the thing by doing the thing. You did the thing by starting. He went to the plaza on Tuesdays. He went because the place where something begins is part of the record. He went because the record should be witnessed. He went because the work was here, and that was reason enough, and it had always been reason enough, and he was a man who had learned in 4 seconds in a cleared plaza under an alien ship that the only question that mattered when you were afraid, and the stakes were real, and you couldn't see what came next, was not whether you were brave enough, or authorized enough, or credentialed enough. The question was, is the job here? The answer every Tuesday was, yes. He stood still. He drank his coffee. He went back to work. In the 4th year after the plaza, the Veth proposed something that the human diplomatic teams had not anticipated. It came through the translation system as a formal statement rather than a conversational development, a shift in register that the linguists had learned to identify as the Veth equivalent of tabling something for the record, making an official proposal, rather than exploring an idea. The content took 3 sessions to fully convey, because the concept involved Veth frameworks for interspecies cooperation that didn't have direct human equivalents and had to be built from contextual foundations, rather than translated directly. The proposal, in its finally rendered form, was this: the Veth wanted to offer humanity something from their own history, not technology. Technology would come in time, through the joint research programs, in the careful and mutual way that both parties had agreed was the right pace for that particular exchange, not territory or resources or any of the material categories that human historical imagination kept reaching for when it tried to model what an advanced civilization might offer a younger one, something else, something the Veth considered more valuable than any of those things, because it was the thing that had allowed their civilization to survive the 2 near-extinction events, their own history. They wanted to share the record, their full archival record, not the 22 years of humanity observation. They had already shared that, the full record. The Veth civilization's complete accumulated documentation of their own history, from their earliest recoverable accounts through to the present, including the 2 extinction events, and what had been done and what had been lost, and what had survived and how and why and at what cost. The record of a species that had nearly ended twice and had not ended. The specific and detailed record of how they had refused to end. The xenohistory team spent 2 weeks debating the implications. The diplomatic team spent 3 weeks on the governance framework. Fitzgerald spent the entire time largely in the background, which was where he was most useful by that point, available for consultation and context, walking the line between the teams and the work the way he had always walked lines, not as a wall, not as a guide exactly, but as a presence that knew where the gaps were. What he thought during those 5 weeks was this: they are giving us what they wish someone had given them. He didn't say this in any meeting. He said it to Celia at their Wednesday lunch, and she looked at him over her food with the expression she always had when he articulated something she'd already been thinking. That's exactly what it is, she said. They're giving us the manual, he said. Not how to do what they do, how they survive not ending. And they think we need it. I think they think we're the kind of species that will use it. She considered this. Do you think they're right? He thought about it honestly, which he always did with her, because she had no patience for anything less than honest, and had had no patience for it since she's approximately 6 years old. He thought about the Directorate and Vor, and the 146 names. He thought about Adeami and Laskaskosi and Nkosi, and the back room of the food stall, and the 4-year accumulation of documentation that had existed, because 4 people had refused to accept that the names could be filed away. He thought about every bureau captain who had ever quietly ignored a wrong order, and every journalist who had written under 14 pseudonyms, and every medical officer who had sent reports into a system determined not to receive them. I think we are the kind of species that will try, he said, which is not the same thing, but I think it might be the relevant thing. She nodded. She ate. The food stall was busy around them. Ordinary noon-hour noise, the sounds of a city in the middle of everything that cities were always in the middle of. A planet in the middle of something unprecedented, carrying on with the unprecedented work. I thinks it's the relevant thing too, she said. I think that's what the whole 22 years of watching was about. Not trying to find out if we'd succeed, trying to find out if we'd try. He thought she was right. He thought she was right about most things, and had been for several years now, and that this was the best possible outcome of building yourself into something useful by doing the work. That you got to watch the people after you arrive at the same place by a different path, which was the only way it ever worked, the only way anything ever transferred, not by handing it over, but by being the kind of thing that someone else could see clearly enough to decide they also wanted to be. The Veth record offer was formally accepted 8 weeks later. There was a ceremony. He attended as a witness. He wore the same jacket. In his left pocket, the photograph. In his right, the archival object Vansora had given him, the one he had carried for 4 years now, that contained the Veth first record of humanity as a presence rather than an observation. He had read it. He rereads sections of it sometimes, the way you reread something that has altered your sense of what you are. He was still finding things in it. Probably always would be. After the ceremony, in the contact quarters common space, Vansora found him again. The Veth linguist moved through the human crowd with the particular careful deliberateness that the Veth used in human environments, aware of the scale differential, aware of the sensory differences, attentive to the things that required attentiveness, relaxed about the things that didn't. The harmonic was the reflective register, the one Fitzgerald had come to associate with the Veth equivalent of an occasion, not celebratory, exactly, because the Veth didn't celebrate in the way the word implied, but something adjacent to it, the register of a significant moment being acknowledged as such. They stood together in the noise of the common space. Vansora produced the rounded archival object, not the one Fitzgerald carried, the Veth equivalent of a new document, a new container of something recorded, held it outward in the offering gesture. He looked at it. He reached into his left pocket. He held out the photograph. The same exchange they had made the first time, and the second time, and the third. The same objects, the same gesture. The Veth had a concept, he had learned, for the repetition of significant gestures as a form of meaning-making. Not ritual in the religious sense, but what he thought of as structural echo. The decision to make the same shape again and again until the shape itself becomes a kind of language, until the repetition is the statement. We have done this before. We are doing it again. This is who we are to each other. He had taken to thinking of it as the handshake they'd built from nothing, out of a cleared plaza, and 2 beings showing each other what they carried. He accepted the new archive. Vansora accepted the photograph, viewed it, returned it. The harmonic said what it had said before in the plaza, on the day of the signing in the 4 years of Tuesdays. The word for a difficult thing done well, the recognition of cost, the expression of something between praise and solidarity that didn't have a clean human rendering, but that he had come to understand, after years of living in its vicinity, as meaning something close to. The work continues, and you are part of why. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He held the new archive carefully. He thought about his father, getting up at 4 in the morning to do a job that no one thanked him for in a city that chewed people up. He thought about Celia, 23 years old, working late in the translation lab on the floor above them, building the cognitive frameworks that would allow the next generation of this work to happen. He thought about 146 names in a file that was now publicly recorded and formally acknowledged, and had resulted in legal consequences that were inadequate to the loss, but were the beginning of a structure that would eventually make such losses harder to quietly file away. He thought about 4 seconds in a plaza. He thought step by step. He thought that's how all distance is covered. He thought you do the job. The job is here. He finished his coffee. He went back to work.